Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down something a little bit special in that it is going to be a pool fight. But it's not just any pool fight. It is a pool fight by Matate and Jae-woo. And Matate was the person, as you might remember, who won Helsinki Longsword Open 2025. He won this entire tournament. Now, the reason this pool fight is special is because this is the only fight that day that Matate actually lost. And he lost to somebody I know, Jae-woo, who you may have seen on the channel before, but hasn't been featured too recently, at least as far as I remember. Now, the reason I want to show this off isn't just because I want to take something away from Matate, but because I want to show that there is, one, a very real and meaningful way that one can counter the way that Matate fights, but two, to make sure that people understand that just because somebody wins an entire tournament doesn't mean that they're invincible. It doesn't mean that they have some unbeatable style or adaptation that you can't get around. What it usually means is that Matate probably does very much better in his fights against certain kinds of fencer than he does against other kinds of fencers. And that remains true of pretty much everybody. But in understanding what it is about this particular matchup that made it much harder for Matate than it was later on, you can understand some of the adaptations that you can make to your own fencing to try to counteract people who might be your kryptonite in terms of fight. So to start off our first exchange, I first want to explain that the ticker up at the top of the video is correct. It's just got the wrong sides. Jae-woo is on the right, Matate is on the left, and Jae-woo is the blue fighter, as you can see by the armband. They just kind of switched it a little bit for the camera. Also, I want to make a caveat here that a lot of this footage is not so great. Not because there's anything wrong with the camera, but because in most of these exchanges, either the director or a judge is standing directly in front of the action. Now, I still want to do a video on this regardless, because I do still think there's a lot of things to learn here, but just so you know, and you have a little bit of forewarning, a lot of exchanges are going to end with me saying, and I wish I could have known what happened here, but I can't see through the person who's standing in front of the footage. But we're still going to go through it. So for this first exchange, it is a long one, a really, really long one. It lasts almost 40 seconds. And at the end of the day, a match or a round that lasts 40 seconds when there's only 3 minutes of timer is a really, really long amount of time to be feeling out your opponent. Normally, I say in this instance that this is a normal kind of thing that happens, but this is an abnormally long feeling out period. But it also tells us something very important about the mentalities of both fighters, and more specifically about Matate. Matate, which you might not have noticed when you watched his gold medal fight, is actually a very, very defensive fighter. It's not very clear because a lot of the time Matate spent walking backwards and throwing cuts and throwing stabs and getting all kinds of points. It makes it a lot more clear that he is defensive when he's fighting someone else who is defensively minded as well. The reason this first exchange lasts 40 seconds is because neither person is willing to commit. And what that tells you going right into this is that one of the main adaptations you can learn to try to beat someone like Matate is to use the exact same kind of adaptations that you might have against any defensive-oriented fighter. It also recontextualizes a lot of his favorite moves. For example, shooting for the hands, throwing low thrusts to the body, or throwing thrusts to the right bicep. The reason this recontextualizes it is because when you put them under the frame of reference of being defensive, you have a different set of tools to try to counteract those actions. Now, for our second exchange, the next thing to pay attention to is the stances. Matate fights in a right leg forward, kind of plow style stance, and he'll switch between a plow with his point forward and a more vom tog with his point up towards the sky, whenever it feels like he needs to. But what's important to pay attention to here is Jae-woo's stance. And the reason this is important is because Jae-woo fights with his left leg forward, despite the fact that he's right hand dominant, and with his hands very tight to his chest. And the reason this is important to look at is because looking at the kinds of moves and attacks and very defensive attacks that Matate likes to throw, the hand shots, the low thrusts, maybe the thrust over the top every once in a while, but the thrust to the right bicep as well, every single one of those is counteracted in some degree by having this particular stance. By having his right leg back, Jae-woo has voided his right bicep further back to the point where it's just not a very viable target. At the exact same time, Matate simply can't go for the left bicep because Jae-woo keeps both of his hands very tight to his chest all the way in. Now, this does expose his hands, but at the exact same time, because they're so close to his torso, you really can't go for a hand shot in this situation without basically going for a body shot at the exact same time. If you were to go for one of these hand shots, what you'd find very easily is that this Vomtag style position that Jay Woo has would allow him to very easily present his blade forward and conk you right on the head as you went for that hand shot. And the reason this is important is because you have essentially taken away, with just this stance, a lot of Mate's favorite defensive moves. And that means that not only is he going to wait for you to come forward, but because Jay Woo is starting with his right leg back and in a Vomtag stance, he's probably going to take a passing step with every single one of his attacks, meaning that he's going to close distance perhaps a lot further more than Mate has been used to with a lot of his other opponents. By closing the distance further, it's a lot more likely that this exchange is going to result in a double, and a double where both people hit each other is not a very good situation to be in if you love to go for low priority targets. Remember, with this rule set, you get 3 points for a deep target, 2 points for a shallow. That means that if you manage to hit somebody in the hands while moving backwards, but they go all the way in with a big step and they hit you in the head or the torso, then you're going to lose a point. But more importantly, if, as we see with a lot of these exchanges, every time Jay Woo steps forward, he tends to hit his target. And because Mate keeps going for low priority targets, he's in a situation where he basically can do nothing but void out the points. So for this third exchange, we see the stance of Jay Woo really start to pay off in terms of creating a different sort of action from Mate. As we see from this exchange, or don't see, because unfortunately the director walked just directly right in front of the camera, right as the action happened. Not their fault, but what are you going to do about it? Mate goes in for a very deep lunge, and it looks like he's either trying to do an undercut to the bottom of the hands, or he was trying to just throw a generic kind of thrust, after which Jay Woo attempts to parry off to the side and come down with a cut of his own. Again, it looks like it hits the cross guard. They call halt, maybe because they thought they saw something. I don't really know what they were looking at. Ultimately, this results in no points for anybody, so maybe it was a 2 points each, or just a nothing that they had to throw out later. But what's important to note is that when Mate goes for this thrust to the bicep, he has to extend really far. He has to go into a very deep lunge to try to reach his target. And the reason he has to do that is because his favorite target, that right bicep, is now about 6 inches back because his opponent is standing with his right leg back. So we're already seeing Mate switch from a very defensive stance to a much more aggressive stance, and he's going very deep for his targets now. And the thing about going deep with a thrust is that if you miss, you often end up going way past your target and up way closer to your target than you really intend to. This is a prime opportunity for a parry repost combination, and is one that Jay Woo is clearly trying to do. However, we can still say the athleticism of Mate here, because he goes into such a deep lunge, but still manages to get out of it fast enough to defend himself from that parry riposte. Now, next up, we have another exchange where, as far as I know, it resulted in a double, and another exchange where the judge walks in front of the show and I can't really see. But what I expect happens here is that Mate goes for a little bit of a probing strike. Jay Woo seizes this opportunity, steps fully forward with a passing step to try to parry and riposte with a thrust or a cut of his own, and it looks like they both kind of just hit each other in the hands. And this was a classic exchange that you saw from Mate in the gold medal match. However, there's a big difference here, and the difference is that Jay Woo was very easily able to close the distance and strike Mate in the hands at the exact same time. And the reason for this is because of that passing step. If Jay Woo had simply gone a little bit of a lunge with his left foot, or had been right foot forward and done a little bit of lunge with his right foot, chances are he would have been very extended with his hands when he threw this strike, meaning that Mate would not have had to extend nearly as far to throw this very same hand strike, this middle cut straight across the middle, which strikes you in the side of the hands. That kind of middling hand cut is really, really hard to parry, but it's also one that doesn't always result in a huge amount of defense further down your left side arm. Because Jay Woo took his passing step, he was able to close the distance and go for that deeper arm target down here that resulted in him doubling out and getting no points, but resulting in Mate getting no points as well. And while it doesn't necessarily feel good to double in a tournament, one thing you have to be sure to understand is that if someone is going to go for hand snipes while walking backwards, a lot of times going really deep and really far can be difficult. It's easy for someone like Mate, who's very good at distance management and is again very tall, to simply back up further than you can go forward, or at least equally as back as you go forward, snipe you in the hands with your extended target, and just, outdistance you and out footwork you. By changing up that footwork and going for the passing step, you make it significantly harder for even someone like Matate with their big long legs to do a simple step just as far and just as fast as you can do a full passing step with your back leg. Now, apparently Matate got 2 points in the previous exchange. Again, I can't see what exactly happened. But in this exchange, we get the real breakaway exchange for Jay Woo. And what happens in this exchange is, again, partially obscured, but you do get to see really the final action, and that's the most important one. And in my opinion, the reason Jay Woo was successful here is because he manages to pull off the thing that Mate's opponent in the gold medal match was trying the entire time to get to work, but just couldn't get there fast enough before Matate had a big lead. And that thing was interrupt his timing and try to time the fact that he was going for these short, tiny little probing strikes towards the hand, and then use them as an opportunity to close the distance and throw something deep. And that's exactly what Jay Woo does here. Matate is throwing these probing hand shots. He's not really committing to any one of them. And what he wants you to do is he wants you to wait for one of those probing shots to go in and then to just dive in deep head first with like a big cut to the head or something like that. The reason he wants you to do that is because generally with the footwork that he's used to from his opponents, he's able to back up fast enough, snipe those hands, and just get safely at a distance and get 2 free points. But in this particular case, what Jay Woo probes out is he waits for Matate to throw his low thrust. He lets him throw those probing hand shots over and over and over again and just doesn't respond. But then one time, Matate misses one, and he misses one pretty deep. And in my opinion, Matate actually did this on purpose. He missed his hand shot, he let his sword swing around through, and he kind of ended up in like a left vom tog kind of position. But from this position, he lowered his guard straight back into a plow, and Jay watched him duck from his right side to his left side to take that offside line, the side that he always loves to be on here for these, grain harvesting hand shots. And the reason this was a really great time to throw this thrust is because when Matate was transferring from his left side to his right side, Jay had a small but very important opportunity to simply drive a thrust in deep. The reason you want to drive a thrust in deep in this particular position is that when someone's sword is off to their right side, basically, in order to get back to the main line, the through line, they have to close that line and then thrust forward. And that's a pretty difficult thing to do from the outside because you're pushing against your right-hand dominant opponent's strongest side. So by simply driving the point in straight from where Jay Woo started, he's able to seize that center line, stay dominant, and just push his hands against Mate's in order to, one, zone him out, as we see here because Mate's thrust misses, but also to make sure that even if he gets sniped in the hands, he's not going to be able to do so deep enough to get to the head or get to the body if that was considered 3 points in this tournament, and he's not going to be able to get his deep target at the exact same time as he is getting stabbed in the chest. It's a really great execution, a really great move, and one where you can often play this kind of wait for someone to get out of position thrust game, but only if you know exactly when they're going to throw their baited hand shots or their baited something shots, and you wait for that perfect opportunity. Now, this next exchange is in full view of the camera, and of course it's kind of an ugly one, but it is still important to point out because it shows another slight hole in Mate's game, and that is namely that when he's down on points, he doesn't seem to have a lot of great tools for a comeback. Now, one of the things about fencing is that in most rule sets, hitting will get you points, but getting hit will get you lose points, and both of you hitting each other will usually result in either nothing or something even worse. So the reality of being down on points is actually very, very daunting. It's very difficult to get those one light exchanges, those exchanges where you hit and your opponent doesn't hit at all. And oftentimes it requires different kinds of techniques and different kinds of mindsets in order to get those clean points. And Matate doesn't seem to have those tools. He, once again, in this exchange, backs his opponent into a corner with his footwork, and that's nice, but then he doesn't have any kind of action that he uses to capitalize on this positional advantage. He simply throws what looks to be a kind of stop thrust, the kind of thrust where you throw it out and you say, okay, well, it's up to my opponent to kind of walk into it. And then he flicks it up in a little bit of a last-ditch effort to try to maybe nick the chin a little bit. And at the exact same time, Jay Woo, who is waiting for an opportunity of a miss, simply throws an undercut to the hands, and neither of these look really great. I wouldn't actually call either of these a very valid strike. But what's more important here is to note that despite the fact that Matate had backed Jay Woo into a corner to a point where he could not retreat, the attack that he threw still wasn't in distance to actually strike his opponent on its own merit. He didn't go deep enough or committed enough to actually land the hit. And this tells you something about how Matate fences. As I said in the beginning, he's obviously a very defensive-oriented fighter, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in these situations, being defensively oriented when you're down on points is a really problematic mindset to still have, because you have to get aggressive in order to land strikes, and if the only thing you're good at is landing strikes when somebody else commits, you're significantly more likely to double, resulting in no points for either person. And when you're down 3 points, and you can only get 3 points by getting a clean, deep target shot, that's not the mindset or the strategy that you need to be employing. Now, in this next exchange, there's actually a completely separate strategy for trying to deal with a fencer like Matate, and it's one that's insanely risky, and in my experience, not one that actually works out all that well most of the time, but it is the stepping parry. Now, one of the aspects of Matate's fencing that we've talked about more times than not right now is that he loves to go for shadow hand snipes while walking backwards. And one of the ways that you can try to deal with that is, of course, moving forward. But the difficulty is that anything you throw while moving forward exposes your hands, you get hit in the hands, and if you don't move forward fast enough, well, then you just got hit in the hands, and then Matate kind of runs away. So what do? Well, a stepping parry is one of the solutions to that. However, it relies on you, A, knowing almost exactly what kind of strike your opponent is going to throw, and B, landing your parry so perfectly that no judge on planet Earth thinks that you got hit in the hands. And when Matate, who is very, very good at throwing these low, shallow, horizontal hand strikes, those are really, really hard to parry, especially with a step forward. So Jay does a really good job here, and basically the way he manages to pull this off is by throwing what is almost a stepping crumphow. If you don't know, a crumphow is defined by having crooked hands, and it's very nebulous as to what that actually means, but in my opinion, what it really means is that you're not on the center line. If you parry by kind of crossing the center line, that's more of like an active Zorn kind of deal. But if you parry by simply pointing your blade towards where their blade is coming from, use your shield style crossguard to just kind of get in the way, chances are you're performing some kind of crumphow. And in this particular instance, what Jay Woo does is he goes from his right vom tog with his hands against his chest to just crumping over to his left side, engaging Mate's blade only as much as he needs to, and then using that to pull off and throw a big left side cut. Now, when Matate gets parried, he once again reveals that he is a very defensive-oriented fighter, because his instinct in this moment is, upon feeling parried, is not to, oh my god, I need to parry the follow-up cut that's inevitably coming towards my head, but is to simply pull off, rely on his footwork, go backwards as fast as he can, and just throw another follow-up hand strike. And he lands it. He lands it because, of course, with the stepping parry, Jay Woo managed to close distance both with his initial step and his follow-up step, but it also means that he was able to hit what looked to be close to an upper area target. Now, again, I don't really understand what goes on with the judging in this one. I believe they call it just a double to the hands, and they don't really award any points, and it's very strange. But what at least matters to me is the fact that this stepping parry could have very easily turned into a 1 point for Jay Woo, because when he stepped and when he parried, he had a clean shot to the head that was free and open, and Matate did absolutely nothing to parry. And if you want to try to counteract a person who fights like Matate, who's always walking backwards, always throws his hand strikes, and maybe doesn't even throw up a parry when you manage to parry them in the first place, this is a really good idea. Just be warned right now that if you continue to try to stepping parry, you're probably going to get stabbed in the face. So this is going to be the final exchange, and it's another bit of a messy one. Jay Woo goes for a low thrust, lands it because low thrusts are hard to parry, and Matate tries to go for like a high head cut, but throws it just really, really flat. And in my opinion, this probably should have just been a double, but at the end of the day, Jay Woo's strategy here is a pretty sound one. If you go for a low thrust and you manage to hit a deep target with that thrust, Matate has absolutely zero options of gaining any points, and he's already down by 6. So as long as you just keep going deep when you're up by 6 points, chances are you're never going to lose. But what's important to point out here is, once again, we see the defensive nature of Matate. Jay Woo goes in for his big thrust, and Matate makes, as far as I can tell, no real attempt to parry at all. He is sitting in a right side guard, which means that his arms are already on the right side of his body, and he attempts to kind of sweep the parry off to the side from the right to the right, And there's really only one kind of cut that would ever parry, and that's a cut towards his hands. So it seems like Matate is very, very used to a pre-programmed response where anyone who's coming forward and doesn't quite make that distance, he's probably assuming that they're going for his hands and that everything else will just be outranged by his footwork. Not a bad strategy overall, but in this kind of heavily committed low thrust, he wasn't able to get out of the way in time. That passing step probably helped once again. And most importantly, when Matate went for his follow-up strike, it looks like some wires got crossed a little bit. He probably thought he was going to go for a hand shot, realized too late that he got stabbed in the belly, and he had to go for a headshot in order to equalize the points. And that middling sort of interpretation that he did ended up in his cut being very flat. And it is, once again, not obscured by the judges, very, very flat. It's okay. It's a mistake that everybody makes. It happens a lot when you're starting out in thumb grip. It's nothing really a problem. So it does make it seem like Jae-Woo won by a absolutely massive margin, but it really, in my opinion, came down to a couple of key exchanges. One, the double thrust where Jae-Woo did a really good job of zoning him out and dodged a follow-up thrust in return. But what's also very important to point out here is that the reason Jae-Woo won is because he was never down on points. He never fell for the kind of bait that Matate was so good at capitalizing on, mainly those ones where he is on the offense, or at least on the offensive defense, he's up on points, and he's able to just back up, snipe your hands, back up, snipe your hands, back up, stab you in the belly, back up, stab you in the bicep. And that is a really great strategy for when you're up on points. And it's a really great strategy against most fencers because they love their 3-point shots. They love their deep targets. They love their favorite moves. And if you know how to shut down someone's favorite move by just sniping in the hands and moving away, you should absolutely do that. But in these particular cases, the reason Jae-Woo won is because A, his favorite moves involve a passing step with his back leg, which is his right leg, and that gave him that little bit of extra distance that kept to overwhelm Mate's backward footwork. And 2, because he was never down on points. He was never in a situation where he couldn't double and come out as more or less the victor. So, as much as you might hate to see it, doubling strategically can be a strategy when you're up on points. And if you're the person who's used to being up on points and doubling to stay ahead, maybe you need something in your toolbox to be able to bail yourself out of that situation. And maybe if you need some strategies to bail yourself out of a low point differential, maybe you can use some of Jae-Woo's here. Start off in that Vom Tog. Keep your hands planted to your chest. Make sure that every time you take a big step, you're taking a really big step and you're hitting the person that is not where they are, but 12 inches behind where they are. And in those situations, you might end up doubling a lot. But if you can get the better of a double with a high priority and a low priority, you're going to get points. And most importantly, if you can get that one crisp and clean deep target shot where you zoned out your opponent for that wonderful 3 points, chances are you're going to be up on points. And now you can continue that strategy for the end of the fight and win. So that's going to be it for today. If you want to win Helsinki Longsword Open, but you don't know how, feel free to watch some videos next week, as I will tell you how I think I could do it, at which point I will then never go to Helsinki, because then I will be revealed for the fraud that I am. So I'll see you next week.